Welcome to the Real People, Real Business Show. My name is Stephanie Hayes, and I'm a business strategist who helps experienced business owners design asset-based business models that set their businesses up for growth and exit. I love to speak with like-minded entrepreneurs to share their real stories and the gritty details on how they've navigated their own way through. On this show, you won't hear about glamorized entrepreneurship journeys that you see online, and you won't be told how to make six figures in 6 weeks. Instead, you can expect to hear real, vulnerable, and inspiring stories that you can relate to that have helped create the foundation for each of our guests' businesses. Today, I'm so excited to welcome Ethan Song. Ethan is the CEO of Rare Circles, where he helps creators and brands build communities in the Web3 economy. Previously, Ethan was the founder and CEO of Frank and Oak, which aimed to reshape the fashion industry by making it more personable and sustainable. Frank and Oak was named one of the most innovative companies in retail by Fast Company and was #1 on the Deloitte Fast 50 list. Ethan was born in China, but has spent most of his life in Canada. Ethan was previously a member of the CEO Council of Canada and a mentor for various organizations, including Techstars and the C100. Welcome to the show, Ethan, and thanks so much for taking your time to share your story today.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
So I want to hear the whole story. You went from fashion to Web3, and you started up one of my favorite stores, Frank and Oak. So where do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, I can start from where it started. I would say that, I've kind of always wanted to be an entrepreneur. And so before, I founded those companies or had any ideas for anything I wanted to do, I knew that I wanted to be in control of my life. I wanted to build cool products that people could use. And I was interested in just the whole process of like company building and shaping your own path. And so I actually come from a more technical background. I studied in engineering out in Vancouver. And after that, I worked for about 2 years in, I guess what you'd call a real job. I was working at that time in consulting for Deloitte. Did that for about 2 years. And then I felt like I needed to get some experience before I got started. And then after that, I was like, okay, I'm on my own now. It's time to get started. The funny thing is, I just quit my job. I didn't have an idea. I didn't have like a side business. I kind of took a quite risky path, which was basically just start from nothing. And it actually took me a year to really get started because I was looking for ideas or business to get started. As you know, when you have no money, no clear ideas or no opportunities, you're basically completely starting from scratch. And from there, I found my way to like software. And specifically, I was interested in commerce software because at Deloitte, a lot of our clients were retailers and brands. And so that's kind of how I got into the branded space. We built the software and, had some early clients. But what really happened was that I thought that the entrepreneurs building on the branded side had so much more fun than I did. And that was around 2011, 2012, when, a lot of the great D2C brands that we know today were built, like the Warby Parker of this world. And I was kind of like, hey, I want to do that. And so I switched my focus towards launching my own brand, which became Frank and Oak. And, what really, I think, differentiated our business at Frank and Oak in the early days was a focus on one underserved category of customers, in that case, millennial men. And the second piece was focusing on service versus just the product, meaning helping them choosing their clothing, helping them dress better. Over time, Frank and Oak became quite a large company. It added women's wear, added all these new categories, and the focus of the company has really kind of anchored itself on making products that are more sustainable and more friendly for the planet. I basically left the company in early 2020, late 2019. And then, I spent some time, as an investor. I was interested in advising and helping other entrepreneurs be successful. But, very quickly, I realized that I was still interested in building. And so I was looking for the next opportunity. And I effectively was interested in this idea, which I had for a while, which was that the businesses of the future were not going to be focused on a single product, but rather a community. And so that, this idea of like minimal community was really intriguing to me. And I realized that, Web3 as a new technology could play a role in that. And so I've been doing that for the last 18 months. It's been great so far. And anyways, it's a long story, but I'm happy to answer any questions related to any parts of it.
No, I love it. And so I've got lots of questions and lots of different pieces of it. And when I first knew Frank and Oak, what was interesting about Frank and Oak was there was a different buying model, right? And it's, if I remember correctly, there was an app and you could sign up for some type of, bundle that would be
Yeah.
given to you. Like it was novel, right? You didn't necessarily choose individual items, which I think you could eventually, but you were given sort of a box and said, here's your clothing based on your preferences. And then, now there's retail locations, and there's, it's a more traditional model, isn't it? But tell me a little bit about kind of where that came from.
Yeah, I would say I think where Frank and Oak really innovated was like in the, in the membership experience side of things. I think the idea where it came from was because we started in men. What we found when we surveyed at that point, I would say our customers were typically like 20 to 35. It's like young men. A lot of them like, would read in GQ or look at some blogs or look at some magazines, but really they needed help to dress better. And so what we realized is rather than give you a magazine and have you like shop around, which a lot of guys didn't like to shop around, what if we just deliver to you the perfect outfits for whatever context that you were into? And so we started this effectively combination of product and styling services all in one. And we added content on top of that effectively also to help men dress better. And so that was how it got started. Funny thing enough is that it gained more momentum once we introduced women as part of the customer base, even though our insight really came from the men's side. And I think, look, a lot of people are busy. A lot of people also like to have a different kind of experience. And so that's kind of how the experience was created. But definitely we're very early in that. We're also very early in applying AI and having actual like data, intelligence as part of how do we make better recommendations? How do we know, what do you like? How do we use your buying behavior to inform the next decision? If you think about it, in the old ways of doing things, you would, go to a store and you would always work with the same person who kind of becomes your stylist. Well, they definitely remember what you bought last time. They also know that now you just got a new job, and maybe, previous job didn't require you to dress up. Now you have to, wear something a little bit more formal because now you're a manager. And so how do we take that information and provide value based on that at scale for hundreds of thousands of customers was a big challenge. And I think we were early in that.
Yeah, and the layers of this experience are so interesting to me because, on the surface, someone sees, fashion. Oh, he must be like a fashion guy, like a retail, like a, a creative and
Yeah.
a visionary in the fashion. But really, you were almost driving this from a technology perspective and from a community perspective. And that's what sort of fed the vision for the creative, right?
Yeah, I think in my case, like I was never the designer of the clothing. And, I think, the Frank and Oak brand is not necessarily known to be the most creative. I think there are brands out there, but I would say what made our product and our experience interesting, I think related to my own sort of strength, is a good balance between storytelling and the application of technology in a way that people can understand. And so, that's something that I often speak about, which is like, how do you make something that's quite complex simple so that, anyone can benefit from it? And I think that's something that we did well at Frank and Oak. But I would say that, brand definitely did play a big part as well. I think ultimately, especially as it relates to clothing, people want to buy brands that they share values with. So I think what's interesting about Frank and Oak actually is that in the early days, it wasn't so much about brand, it was more about the service. And over time, the brand became a larger reason why to buy.
It was the personalization. And I also think that it's like, your market, right? It's very minimalist. It's very like the people who hold those values are going to be attracted to the clothing like I am. I'm not somebody who's drawn to big patterns and super creative. Like I loved the more simple and more minimalist designs. And so I think your personalization was, super important. And now you've moved to Web3, which is very, again, there's that thread of community, and Web3 is all about property, ownership of property, and that sort of autonomy inside of the space and owning what you produce. So tell me a little bit more about the business in the Web3 economy.
Yeah, I mean, basically at Risk Circles, we offer a product called Portal, which is basically a community product that you can access if you're an owner of an NFT or a token, or if you bought a subscription to that site. What's interesting about it is that it's really the future of memberships and fan clubs. To simplify in terms that I think everyone understands, what we're finding is that, you know, customers today are not interested in traditional loyalty programs anymore, which is really about accumulating points and discounting. They want new experiences. They want to be heard from their favorite brand. They want to be part of the brand. And so we effectively power those experiences and those relationships. And the interesting thing part about Rare Circles is that, often people ask me, "Oh, are you guys an NFT company?" And the reality is that there's components of, blockchain technology that we leverage, but the selling of the NFT is not what we do. What we actually do is the engagement that comes with being part of that community. And so, but yeah, absolutely. It's interesting because I do think that both the idea of membership and the idea of community-based businesses is actually a through line between what I did previously and what I'm doing now. And to be honest, I think also it's because I love being part of great communities. I'm into lots of things where there are communities around that, like, snowboarding or skateboarding or surfing. I'm also into like the NFL and the NBA. And so like all these great communities where you can share things with others, I feel like are extremely important. I would say the other thing that I'm seeing is, I think for D2C businesses, it's harder than ever to acquire new customers, and it's harder than ever to keep the customers you have. And so the deeper the relationship you can create with your early customers, the more longevity you're going to have in your business. And so I think our product helps you actually to solve some of those issues.
So why the focus on Web3 and not just, brands out there in the traditional world? Web3, I know, is, most of the decentralized finance business, I guess you can call them businesses or startups, are very heavily community focused, right? And that's what's driving the growth and driving the development. And of course, you have the spectrum of everything from these really interesting reinventions of very traditional financial instruments to these very very Ponzi-ish, glamorous types of startups. And there's everything in between. It reminds me very much of the .com, the .com world, right? So why Web3?
I would say, look, I think the interesting part is like, we believe that, Web3 has a power of creating a deeper relationship between a brand and its fans. Can you have that same relation without it? Absolutely. And I think that there are ways in which you can use our product without Web3, but the Web3 really supercharges that. So like one thing that I believe is true is that like Web3 does not make the community. That's just the technology, right? The community are the people involved and whatever links them together, whether it be an activity or whether it be like, values. And that's what happens. But by injecting some components Web3, you can accelerate the growth of that community. But I also think that's not right for everyone. Like I do believe that it's very early in the space. And I think it's right. As an example, for sports communities, for gaming communities, it's right. But if you look at food or CPG or like, beauty, I think it's healthcare. I just think it's too early. So I think in that cases, I think those types of experience-based programs and memberships are definitely still possible, but without the technology. I think that in like 3 to 5 years from now, the technology will be fully integrated within those consumer experience that people won't even know what that really means, in a sense that we don't really think about mobile as a new experience today. Whereas, when the iPhone came out, like, 10-ish years ago, it was definitely a new experience. So, the concept of apps, so all these things end up being new. Now, I would say that generally as an individual, I like to work on a future as well. Like I love, the action of solving something that is like not solved, and to kind of be part of creating what that path is. And I think this speaks, I don't know if it's good for business, to be 100% honest, but it's good for me because it keeps me excited. It keeps me passionate about solving the problems.
I love that you said that, because this is a thread, no matter what business you're in or what you're providing. I think that business owners don't focus on themselves and who they are as individuals enough. And when that's aligned, then you're going to put all your energy and all of the momentum into the business. But if you're swimming upstream and trying to build a business that is in conflict with who you are as an individual, or how you work best, or what really drives you, then it's a very difficult thing to get up and do every day, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you should always pick. I think a lot of people are kind of like waiting for the best idea or for the new idea. But
Mm,
I found that the most successful entrepreneurs are doing things that they were always passionate about in areas that they already had knowledge in. And the reason is because most likely you're going to struggle. And when you struggle, if you don't love what you're doing, you're going to give up.
that's right.
Right.
That's
And
right.
the whatever reward that you're looking for as an entrepreneur, whether it's independence, whether it's money, whether it's fame, whatever that is, it might not come, or it might not come for 20, 30 years. And what's going to keep you going is really that day-to-day happiness and being grateful and being connected with your purpose. The only thing I would say though is on top of that, I'm a big fan of the ikigai concept. The Japanese concept is I do think it's what you love, but you should also see what special skill you can bring to that. Meaning, like, as an example, if I want to get into an industry, then the question is which part of the industry I should get into, and I should figure out what is my inner skill that aligns better. So there's passion and there's skill. So the skill set, and what I mean by that is, if you're really good at sales, you should probably, choose an area of your passion where sales can be a competitive advantage. If you're really good at managing or hiring, maybe another type of business could work. If you don't like to talk to anyone, then maybe something more around like, coding or building websites on your own, maybe is a better job. So I think figuring out what's the right alignment between your passion, between what your skills are, and also what the world wants would be where you're going to find happiness. I didn't come up with that, by the way, right? I'm not saying that. Ikigai is where it comes from.
So on that note, when did you know it was time to move on from Frank and Oak and time to start something new?
I would say you kind of know. I think it was like what happens. I spent like 9 years there as both the CEO and the founder, and so like I was involved in everything. And I think it's a combination of factors. I think the business had gone to a pretty large size, with over like 200 employees. I realized that two things I realized, okay, is one, the next chapter, I wasn't sure if I was that equipped to be successful in the next chapter of scaling the business. And two, I also realized that I wasn't sure. I felt like I had done as much as I could, basically, within the context of that business. Now, I think it's different with every business, right? So you could go much further, you could go less far. It's really up to you. But at that point in time, I felt like I had taken as far as I could based on what we wanted to achieve. And I was also interested in doing other things, having spent basically most of my life at that point in that single business. I was looking forward to actually experimenting and working with other things. And specifically, I was actually interested in going back to focus on technology. And so, which was, where I actually started. And so running a brand was actually never my dream. And that's the funny part is, I wanted to start and run technology companies. And so at that point, I felt like I had spent enough time doing that. So it's the reality is that between when you start having those kind of thoughts and when you actually activate, it was like 24 months for me. So it wasn't like that sudden. It may seem sudden to people that you tell at the moment, but I think most people realize that. I would say that what I tell other, a lot of young entrepreneurs, that often people feel as though their identity is tied to their business. And it definitely feels like that. But I think once you make a change or you do something else, you realize that it's not, you are who you are, and that is part of your history. Now, once again, I think every situation is different. Like, I think it's amazing if someone sticks in the same business for 25 years. I think that's an amazing amount of success. Just like I think it's amazing someone, grows their business for 5 years and sells it. I think every situation is different. I also think every entrepreneur within every situation is different. So I would say just listen, to your instinct, know what you want to get out of it, know what you want to do next. And based on that, you'll probably understand where you're situated in that decision.
And I think that the entrepreneurship world is changing too, where there's a lot more tolerance or acceptance for that sort of short turnaround. And I know I grew up in the Vancouver tech scene, right? The Vancouver startup tech scene. And, back in the day, it was like, no, you start a business and you hang on to it. And now, it's like, yeah, it's fine. You start up a business, and an exit strategy can be a viable goal, and maybe you build for that first phase, and then it's your time to get out, because that's where you do your best work, is in that first startup phase, to find somebody, an entrepreneur who can do really well in the startup phase and then in the sustainment phase and then in the growth phase and then in the like the sunsetting phase, those are almost four very different skill sets. So I'm glad that you say that, because I think it's okay to be the right person for that certain phase of growth, and then you can move on.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely think that focusing on what you want to do and what your strengths are makes a lot of sense. And yeah, absolutely. I think as a leader, you might not be right for every step. Of course, I also believe if you wanted to, you could learn and be the right person at those steps, but you don't have to be. I think it's a personal choice. It depends on the opportunity and the company. But like I absolutely agree that it's not because you started that you have to be there the whole time. I think that pressure is not needed.
So you're now building for the Web3 space, for the community building, and like, are you in competition with like a Discord, or are you in competition with, who's out there sort of putting pressure on you right now?
I mean, I think the interesting thing is that, we're more a complementary product. I think really the space that we play in is fairly new. And so for
Mhm.
us, it's less about competition. I think it's more about making sure that what we build ends up being very useful for individuals. And
Yeah.
so, I'll give you an example, like, even something like Linktree is not a competitor, but something that's new. It didn't really exist. That concept of having that kind of like, other platform on top of social media didn't exist. So I think what our platform is more similar to that. But that said, the reason why I'm saying it's not competitive is because a lot of our users also have Discord, so therefore it can be competitive. But that said, I would say what we're looking to do is recognize patterns that already exist, and that effectively have no platforms for those patterns, and then create an opportunity where you make the experience easier. It's similar to that kind of Airbnb story in a sense that like people were already renting their houses on like Craigslist, or like finding ways to like make extra money to pay rent. And so although when it came out it was new for a lot of people, the reality is that it was already happening at a smaller scale. But by making it easier, you open up the size of the market and having
Mhm.
more people being engaged in that experience.
So who are your customers?
Yeah, so in our case, actually, we're more focused on businesses. And so typically they're, small and medium businesses. We have a few larger customers, but the three areas that we focused on are the whole sports area. So like sports teams, sports brands. And the reason why is because there's strong communities and a strong level of like fandom in those spaces as well. The second segment that we're focused on is gaming. So like game developers, game esports. Once
Yep.
again, very close to sports, so strong communities there. And lastly, brands, more as a broader group of companies. So those are typically who we work with. Now, the interesting part is that we're really like a B2B2C company in the sense that like even though our clients are businesses, the product that we build are used by their fans or by their customers. And so we kind of need to understand what that end user wants as well. And what we found is, surveying that customer, that individual is really the best way to figure out how to create value. Because if you create value for a customer, you are creating value for the merchant. It's kind of like it's kind of like the same relationship.
Yeah, in the world of software development, it's not quite as easy, right? You're typically building requirements for, an end user, but you have this layer in between. I know we have the same thing with our software company, that our product we're actually selling to the business, but the end user is their quote unquote client, right? And so we have to make sure that we have understood what that end user actually wants, but also what is motivating the people who are paying us the money. So how have you navigated that?
I think a big part of that is, I think, yeah, absolutely. There's multiple stakeholders in that relationship. Even within the businesses that are your clients, like they may have multiple stakeholders as well. And so I would say the best way to navigate that is through data. Be able to demonstrate, here's why we made such decisions, here's why this product we think is useful, and also create content. So like, like guides, like basically educating your end user on what the product can do for them, and supporting that with data is probably the best way. Now, that said, just like Shopify or some of the other platforms, we can't make you successful either, right? Like the reality is, just like, with podcasting, you might be using Zoom or Riverside or whatever platform, but if you're not a great podcaster, or if you don't tell amazing stories, you're not going to be successful. So I think understanding that our goal is to make you successful. And if you don't succeed, we don't succeed. But that in the end, there's still a degree of control that like the individual communities have in their success. But that said, I would say generally is measuring and surveying the end user and then providing that data with some education to the merchants.
So where do you see this going? What, like, if you could anticipate some innovation, where do you think that you guys might be headed? Like in 5 years, are you still a community-driven, community-based software application, or where do you think the emerging trends are coming from?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good question. And I don't want to reveal too much about where I think we're going to be because it's so new and most likely I'm wrong. But if there's a chance I'm right, I could be very right. But I would say, look, I think that there's a few things that are going to happen. I think that I definitely think that brands and organizations are thinking about having their own platform for their community and not just depending on like, Facebook and Instagram and YouTube, because they realize that they're highly dependent on those for advertising and for data. And so I think, first party data is very important. I think owning your community is going to become more and more important. I think for community members, also understanding that, you're being advertised to and that you actually want to have benefits from that if you're going to be advertised to. I think that is also another component. So effectively, this whole idea of ownership in the community from both the fan side as well as the brands and the merchant side, I think is something that I truly believe that's going to happen. I think the second piece is, as I mentioned before, whether it's mobile, whether it's Web3, or whether it's even elements of AI, I think all of that will be embedded within experiences and the experiences are going to be richer. That said, I also think that we're going to see a trend towards more digital communities and digital world at the same time as people wanting real life experiences and tangible community where you see people in real. So I think we're going to see both of those trend kind of collide, but I actually think it's not a collision. I think the same individuals want both. So that's another thing that I see happening. And I know I'm not telling you anything about what I'm doing, but I'm telling you what's going to happen in the world.
No, that's totally okay. I get it.
but I think that those are really, really interesting areas for whoever is listening to this podcast to actually, think about how these things will impact the lives, our future lives.
Yeah, and I think you're still a little on the bleeding edge in terms of the majority of the kind of the businesses out there that are still entrenched in our more traditional business worlds. But I think that we can't ignore some of the trends that you've talked about and some of the technologies that are coming out. And it's a typical adoption cycle, right? Like, for example, there's this huge explosion in interest in AI right now. And there's all of this dialogue and these conversations about how it's going to impact the creative market or how it's going to, what it's going to do to us. Yeah. But, in reality, this has been, machine learning and AI and all of the technologies that are now emerging. They've been in development for a really long time. And now we're just starting to see the tip of the iceberg and the thin edge of the wedge where there's some consumer application or there's something that's all of a sudden become relevant to a much broader audience. And now what's going to happen is it's just going to start on its rocket ship of development, because finally we have people paying attention and the critical mass of feedback that's going to allow all these sort of first movers to start getting enough information about where we need to go. So I think that it's typical and it starts to build.
I mean, what I found that's interesting is whenever there's a new kind of wave, a new movement from technology, you see both. You see people that embrace it and you see people that kind of fight against it. And I think the reason is because it can be unsettling because you kind of reconsider your priorities. But as it relates to AI specifically, when I think about writers or I think about creators in general, it's interesting that they criticize it because their job didn't exist like 10 years ago, right? Before social media was invented. And so, journalists used to complain about creators or like other artists used to complain about digital creators. And so I would say you can't, criticize something that made you successful. And rather than criticizing it, I think it's more about adapting and embracing it and figuring a way to make that part of what makes you different. So, and as we've seen, you don't have to pick up on every trend or every new kind of development, but you have to kind of get on with some of them in order to be relevant in the world of tomorrow. But generally, yeah, whenever there's something new, more opportunities are created than are being destroyed. That's what I found.
Well, you get to choose too. And I think, I have a friend, one of my best friends is a designer and she's an artist, and she has completely embraced AI and the AI art engines, because she's recognizing that it's not going to replace her skills. It's just going to change the work that she does. And it's the same with the writers, and the same, you get to embrace it in the way that actually helps you. Because a lot of, who wants to build, nobody likes to make logos in the graphic design world. So, use AI for that kind of work, or whatever, right? But it's, it's a typical trend in the adoption of new technologies that we have this kind of resistance, and that's what we're seeing right now. So you are immersed in an economy that is very much in its infancy right now. Does that cause you any concern, or do you feel fear around that, or how do you manage being on that sort of bleeding edge?
I mean, I guess what would be the fear for? The fear of failure? Or the thing is,
It's uncertainty, right? There's a lot of uncertainty.
Right? Yeah. I would say, I guess, yeah, it's a really good question. That's what usually I come up with a fast answer. You can see now I'm thinking about it. So you got me
Good, we
down with
want
a
to
question.
think.
I would say that there's uncertainty, but the way I see it is, like, I think people think of it as risk, right?
Yeah.
Like, because it's uncertain, you don't know, you could be wrong. And so what I've learned throughout my short entrepreneur career is that even when you're wrong, being early in something that has the potential to be big pays lots of dividends later on, whether in this project or whether in future projects. And so from that perspective, no, I don't have any concerns. But I do think that to succeed in a space where, the guideposts haven't been fully defined yet, you have to be willing to experiment. You need to have a team that's super agile. You have to be willing to fail fast. So definitely it requires a certain type of entrepreneur, and it requires a certain type of team. And I don't think it's for everyone.
It's not.
But from a pure like risk perspective, like, I'm not worried about the risks as so much as, because I understand, I truly believe it's something that's going to be transformative. And therefore, to me, the risk would be to not be involved, actually.
I agree. And I think what you're getting at is that when you're a player in the sort of the very early stages of a market, it's mostly about setting your expectations. Because I think if you go in with really traditional expectations around entrepreneurship and building a new business, you would be very uncomfortable, because those are very rooted in like a established business, established understandings of the way that business works. But when you go into a very new market, you really need to be, your expectation needs to be that we're moving quickly in a lot of different ways, and we will learn things that disprove our early assumptions, and that's okay, that's progress, right? So I think you have to go in with a very different mindset and a very different set of expectations around how your business is going to progress. Maybe I'm wrong.
No, I think that makes sense. But I also think that, like, I think it, like, going back to, like, you have to be the type of entrepreneur that seeks those experiences. I think is, some entrepreneurs are better at taking something that is already working and scaling that, like going 100x on something. Whereas, like, I prefer being in that creation phase. And so, like, I see success as being able to create something new. And so that's also the reason why, I think I've taken this decision. But that said, I think that the one thing that's important is to understand who you are and understand what you're getting into. And then based on that, figuring out the right parameter for how you define success and how you define happiness within that.
And how big is your team now?
We have a team about 20 at the moment.
Yeah, good. That feels about right, for where you guys are at. Awesome.
Yeah.
I have a question that I ask all of my guests before we finish up. What's the difference between what we hear out there in the business world and the online business world, and what's real about being a business owner?
I think, there's lots of things. Everything is different, but I would say that, there's definitely less glory than it seems. there's more alone time. I think there's more struggles. And that's why like I feel like because, like startups, entrepreneurship has been quite glorified in the last 10 or 20, which I think is fantastic. And it does give the false the false impression that everyone can be successful and that everyone can go out there and raise money and like run like a unicorn. I think like, that's like not true. And how you realize how like it's very difficult to build $1 million business, to build a $10 million business. And it's basically almost impossible to get to $100 million. And so I think once you understand that, is key. The second thing also is understanding that you don't control everything, and that when you read an entrepreneur's story and they tell it backwards, like let's say on shows like How I Made It and things like that, it feels like they had this master plan all along. Whereas the reality is that, they probably had some kind of plan, but whatever happened, they didn't plan and they got quite a bit lucky along the way. And so that's another factor that people don't tell you, is that like anyone that works hard and is passionate will succeed, but how much you're going to succeed is not only based on you. It's based on a lot of factors that you don't control. And obviously right now we're kind of in this like more challenging markets. Well, you don't control that, and I hear people complain about that. And I always say, well, you didn't realize that you won the lottery the last 2 years because there was so much growth and money in the market. And so I think having been around for a while, you realize that, there's ups and downs, and it's just part of the whole experience. So I think that's another factor. I think the last piece also I would say is you do have to be good at multiple things. The best product doesn't always win. The best leader doesn't always win. You do have to like be multi-skilled, and you have to kind of like, surround yourself with the right people, which actually means you need to be good with people also to a certain extent. So I think that's another factor that often you don't see basically in the public.
Yeah, those are all really good points. And you're a serial entrepreneur. You have had multiple businesses. What keeps you going? What keeps you from, returning to the workforce and getting a job? Why do you stay as an entrepreneur?
Well, I mean, I think part of it is, as an entrepreneur, you don't have to ask permission for anything. You can just do it, right? You don't need to show your resume. You don't have to be qualified. You're qualified because you decide you want to do it. So I think that's extremely powerful, because, we talk about like a life where, there are places that you feel you can get into. There's rooms that, you can get into, or there's a ceiling to what you think your skills are. But as an entrepreneur, there is not. And like you have, the ability in your hands to change that. And so I feel like that's extremely empowering. And that's one of the reasons why I do it. But secondly, I just like the action of creating. Like I like Frank and Oak right now is a great company. It's still going, and I'm not as involved, anymore. But I love the fact that's the case. It's almost like you had a baby and now your baby's grown up and it's doing its own thing now. And so I think that is awesome. And so that's why, I'm a serial entrepreneur. But I don't think it's like, people talk about that and like repeat entrepreneurs or, repeat founders. I don't really think it like that. I just think about it's like, well, what else am I going to do? And and so to me, it wasn't like that hard of a decision. I think it's something I've always wanted to do. And I do think that as you get more experienced, the things that are very stressful, like, money and cash and like employees and all of that, become a little bit less stressful because you have a little bit more experience. You're less emotional about it, I think, effectively. And so it's not that there aren't challenges. It's just that I think you're more experienced at how to handle those challenges, and you're less affected personally by them. So those are all things why I think, that's why I'm doing it, but also why I think it's, it's great to be able to do it multiple times, and I think part of the society that we live in is the fact that like you can actually be a repeat entrepreneur, and it doesn't matter whether you succeed or you fail in your first venture. Like as long as you have determination and great ideas, there's always space for you. And I think that's something that's encouraged by our society, and it's amazing that it is.
Yeah, you've said everything so articulately that, I'm sitting here nodding because all of it resonates with me, as well as somebody who is basically unemployable again. Like, I don't know that I could ever get hired again in a job, having had the experience of being on my own for so long. And I think one of the things that you have that a lot of serial entrepreneurs don't have, surprisingly, it is, your first venture is still up and running, and it's still, successful, and it's still, meeting a need for a broad audience. And I know like my daughter and I both went
Yeah.
shopping at Frank and Oak, and it appeals to her as a 15-year-old girl as much as it appeals to me as a 48-year-old woman, right? And so I think that that's a real win. And a lot of serial entrepreneurs don't have that to look back on. The number of startups that don't succeed or that don't have longevity is
But that's
far
also the reason
greater.
why, I realized very quickly that money wasn't like the most
Yeah.
important thing. Because it's like, lots of entrepreneurs sell their company for lots of money, and then the company disappears, or the employees are being fired the next day. Basically, your community effectively is gone. And then you're just at home with like nice and fancy cars. Like, what does that give you? You know what I mean? Like that is not meaningful. So absolutely. I mean, I take great satisfaction in the fact that like, the company is still going. I have some of my employees that are still there in leadership roles. There's new creativity coming into it, new management coming into it, and they have new plans for expansion, internationally. So I think all of that is really exciting. But I think part of my personality is also I have been humbled many times as well. I've had lots of challenges at Frank and Oak, not just successes. And so like, I kind of realize it's not just a one-way ticket also. And like, behind every story, it's a lot more complex than what people think it is.
100%. Absolutely agree. Well, we're coming up on time and we're gonna wrap up the episode, but I wanted to ask you if you could share with our listeners how they can find you.
Yeah, sure, for sure. I mean, if you want to learn more about Rare Circles, what it can do for your community, you can find us on Twitter at Rare Circles. If you want to get in touch with me, you can find me also on Twitter at Mr. Ethan Song, and just DM me. And I'm also like a pretty active angel investor. So if you have a cool project, I'm sure there's a lot of entrepreneurs listening to this podcast, feel free to hit me up.
Awesome. I love it. Okay, well, we're going to wrap it up. And I'm so happy that we had the opportunity to chat with Ethan today to hear more about how his businesses came to be, his experiences along the way, and what the future of the business entails. And thank you so much for tuning into this episode of the Real People, Real Business Show, where we get the real entrepreneurial stories and journeys that you can relate to. The show notes, resources, and links from this episode are available on my website and social media platforms. And if you've enjoyed today's content, I would love for you to give us a review on whatever platform you're on to help us share these genuine stories with an even bigger audience. Until next time, keep building, keep dreaming, and keep being real.